Imagine living in conditions like this. Where do you think this is? It's a famous place. Maybe you've been there. Maybe you've seen it on movies, television, pictures. This is Central Park in New York City. We think of it today as a beautiful place with nature where people can enjoy themselves from the hustle and bustle of the city. But for people during the Great Depression, this was home. Daily life in the Great Depression was completely different than we could even think of today. People didn't know where their meals would come from. They didn't know if they would have a roof over their head. They didn't even know what the elements would bring. Many lived outside. Many lived in shacks like the ones we saw at the beginning. Those were called Hoovervilles. They were shanty towns built out of scrap metal and scrap wood, and they were named after President Hoover, really as an insult to his lack of action when the Great Depression started. Hoover's idea was just, that's the way the government is supposed to run. It's laissez faire. We've had this since the 1800s. The business cycle will eventually fix itself, and, you'll get a job someday soon. That obviously didn't happen. People stood in bread lines for free food. Groups like the Salvation Army kept people somewhat nourished. Unfortunately, many children were malnourished. They developed a disease called rickets, caused by a lack of vitamin D because they had no dairy and obviously not a very well balanced diet. This led to deformities, limbs, legs that bowed inward with knees almost touching when someone was standing up straight. Another powerful image for daily life in the Great Depression is this one. Take a look at this picture. What do you see on this woman's face? How old do you think she is? She obviously looks worried. She has 3 children. She actually has more than aren't in the picture. And she's living out of her car. She was a cotton picker in California. Dorothea Lange took this picture. Now, we might look at her today and see the deep wrinkles on her face and think, maybe she's in her 50s or even older. But in fact, this woman was 32 years old. Her face itself tells you how hard life was during the Great Depression. Again, with no action from Hoover and no action from the government, people would demand change. By the time Franklin Roosevelt took office, change would soon come. Here's what you need to know about unemployment during the Great Depression. Imagine the worst economic catastrophe in American history. You don't know where you're going to get your next meal. You don't know when you'll find a new job, if you'll find a job. That's unemployment during the Great Depression. Unemployment reached almost 25% during the Great Depression. That's 1 out of 4 Americans. And just because you didn't lose your job doesn't mean you weren't affected. You might have taken a pay cut or had family members move in that you're now having to support, meaning you yourself have less money. This affected everybody. Here's a good example of just how many people were unemployed. Think of Texas Stadium where the Cowboys play. That's 80,000 attendees. Say you go to a game there one Sunday. 80,000 people, full house. Someone comes on the announcement. You are now unemployed. Guess what? 4 years from now, 2/3 of you will still be unemployed. Now let's repeat that again the following Sunday. A new 80,000 people come in. They're all unemployed. 4 years from on, 2/3 will still be unemployed. If we repeated that for 162 weeks, that would add up to 13 million Americans. That's just how many people were unemployed. People didn't know what to do, like the guys in this picture. They're literally wearing their resume on them in hopes to find a job. Others simply gave up. After all of this was going on, there was this huge need for government action. And the response of Hoover at the beginning was not what people wanted. By the time the 1932 election rolled around, there would be a demand for change.
Did you know that during the Great Depression there was such a movement to free up jobs that over 500,000 American citizens were removed from the country? Because of the intense job loss, the nearly 25% unemployment during the Great Depression, there was a movement to remove Mexicans and Mexican Americans from the United States. People of color were often the last hired for job openings, and they were often the first fired to free up space for white workers. This movement occurred throughout private companies and even government agencies. During the Great Depression, the Hoover administration encouraged businesses to remove or to discourage Mexican Americans from applying, or they would even suggest to them that they would be better off being somewhere else, namely Mexico, than being in the United States. State laws also added to this with, again, encouraging Mexicans to return to Mexico through donations, through free train tickets back, or through actions which actually forcibly rounded up and removed people. Raids occurred in large cities throughout the United States, such as Los Angeles and Denver, as we see in the image to the right. Over 1 million people were removed from the United States. The government often used the term repatriation, which makes it sound like people are simply being sent back to or allowed to go back to the place they came from. They really did not use the phrase deportation, as this sounded more forceful. In actuality, however, people were forcibly removed. Over 1 million people. 60% of those were likely Mexican American citizens born in the United States, but simply rounded up because of lack of documentation, of identification, were sent to Mexico, although they were American citizens. This movement would have profound effects not only on the states and the areas in which they occurred, but of course on the people that were affected. Imagine an ecological catastrophe so terrible you had to leave not only your home, but your state. You had to move hundreds of miles away just to start a new life. That was life during the Dust Bowl. We can see from this image just why the Dust Bowl was called the Dust Bowl. There was sand, dust, dirt that blew everywhere, hundreds and hundreds of miles. Just as important as the effects of the Dust Bowl were its causes. It was caused by overtilling of the ground in the areas of the Great Plains, the areas you see on the map pictured to the right. Farmers in the 1920s were very successful in making a lot of money. That caused them to overtill the soil with new mechanized agricultural tools like gasoline or diesel powered tractors. They tore up ground. Of course, the problem is once you tear up the ground, if you don't have vegetation to hold it in place, the dirt will blow everywhere. That happened when a drought struck at just the right time or just the wrong time. There was nothing to hold the soil down. And as we see in the image, entire farms had to be abandoned. The image on the bottom left tells you, right, an evacuation sale. This family isn't just moving for fun or because they want to move somewhere else. The fact that they're selling everything, all furniture must be sold, that tells you that they don't have a place to go to. Farmers packed up all their belongings and moved to big cities, either east of the Great Plains or to the west, places like Los Angeles, Flagstaff, Arizona. If you've read the book, The Grapes of Wrath, you really get a feel for what was happening during the Dust Bowl. This economic collapse, of course, happened just as the Great Depression was at its worst. So we have two combined factors. We have an ecological catastrophe at the same time as an economic catastrophe. It would take years for America to recover from its effects.